The acrid smell of pine resin and wet tin filled the frozen Appalachian air as George Sodder stared at the smoldering remains of his home on Christmas morning, 1945. Where 5 of his children had been sleeping just hours before, only charred timber and twisted metal remained, but not a single bone, not a fragment of flesh, not even a tooth. This isn't just another house fire story. It's a mystery that defies the laws of physics and challenges everything we know about fire, death, and the lengths people will go to cover their tracks. The nightmare began at 12:30 a.m. on Christmas Eve with a wrong number phone call that jolted Jennie Sodder from sleep. The voice on the other end, unfamiliar and slurred, asked for someone who didn't live there. Jennie heard laughter and clinking glasses in the background before the line went dead. She glanced at the Christmas tree in the living room below, its colorful lights casting a warm glow through the darkness, then settled back into bed beside George. 30 minutes later, smoke crept under their bedroom door. The Sodder family had retired to their timber frame home on State Route 16 in Fayetteville, West Virginia, like any other Christmas Eve. George, a successful businessman who owned a trucking company, had tucked his 10 children into bed with promises of presents in the morning. The older ones, Marion, 23, and Sylvia, 20, were already married and living elsewhere. But 9 children still called the house home, and 5 of them, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, just 5 years old, had climbed the narrow stairs to the attic bedrooms where they always slept. The 4 youngest children, John, George Jr., Alva, and baby Sylvia, slept on the main floor with their parents. When Jenny smelled the smoke and shook George awake, they could hear the crackling of flames somewhere below them. George bolted upright, his mind immediately turning to the children scattered throughout the house. "Get the babies," he shouted to Jenny as he threw on his clothes. "I'll get the ones upstairs." But when George reached the staircase, a wall of flames blocked his path. The old wooden steps were already consumed, the heat so intense it singed his eyebrows. He called out to Maurice, the eldest boy upstairs, hoping to hear a response. Nothing. He screamed their names, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty, until his voice cracked. Still nothing. The Christmas lights continued to twinkle cheerfully in the living room window, their steady glow mocking the chaos inside. How could the electrical system still function if faulty wiring had caused this fire, as the coroner would later claim? The house had been recently rewired, inspected, and deemed safe by the electric company just months before. George's mind raced through options. The attic ladder, it was always propped against the outside wall for roof repairs. He could climb up, break through the window, and pull his children to safety. But when he ran outside into the bitter December air, the ladder was gone, vanished. He would find it the next day, 75 feet down, an embankment far from where it belonged. His coal truck sat in the driveway, both driven earlier that day without problems. If he could drive one close to the house and stand on the cab, he might reach the attic window. George sprinted to the first truck and turned the key. Nothing. The engine, which had run perfectly 12 hours earlier, wouldn't even turn over. He tried the second truck. Dead. A 50-gallon water barrel sat near the house, kept specifically for fighting fires in this remote area where the volunteer fire department was 25 minutes away on a good day. George grabbed a bucket and ran to the barrel, only to find the water frozen solid in the sub-freezing night. Even when he smashed through the ice with a hammer, only a trickle of water remained useless against the inferno that was consuming his home. And he feared his children. Jenny had managed to call the fire department from a neighbor's house, but something felt wrong from the moment she dialed. The phone line at their house had been working fine earlier that evening. How had it failed so completely? She wouldn't learn until later that telephone repairmen had found their line cut 14 feet, up the pole, not burned, but deliberately severed with a blade. But what happened to those 5 children who vanished without leaving so much as a finger bone behind? And why did so many things go wrong on the same night? Ladders disappearing, trucks failing, water freezing, phone lines cut. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if this mystery has already grabbed your attention, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're just getting started. The fire chief's delayed arrival would reveal evidence that turned this tragedy into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Fire Chief F.J. Maurice stared at the smoldering foundation at 8 a.m. on Christmas morning, nearly 7 hours after the first alarm had been called in. The volunteer fire crew shuffled behind him, their boots crunching through the frost-covered debris, wondering why their chief couldn't drive the engine himself, and why it had taken them until dawn to arrive at a fire that had consumed an entire family. 7 hours, in a small town where everyone knew everyone, meant the difference between rescue and recovery, and in this case, it meant the difference between finding bodies and finding nothing at all. Maurice had received the call at approximately 1:15 a.m., just 45 minutes after the fire began. Fayetteville's volunteer fire department was hardly a crack team, but they knew the roads and they knew the stakes. In a rural community where the nearest hospital was an hour away and the nearest professional fire department even farther, minutes mattered. Yet something had gone wrong from the moment Maurice tried to start the fire engine. The chief couldn't drive. Whether it was mechanical failure, inexperience, or something more deliberate, Maurice found himself standing beside a silent fire truck while the Sodder house burned 25 minutes away. He had to wait for another volunteer to arrive who could operate the vehicle. By the time they reached State Route 16, the sun was climbing over the Appalachian ridges, and the house had been reduced to a basement filled with ash and twisted metal. George Sodder met them at what used to be his front gate, his face streaked with soot and his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He had spent the entire night pulling debris from the foundation with his bare hands, calling out his children's names, hoping against hope that he might find them unconscious, but alive in some protected pocket beneath the collapsed floors. "Where are they?" George asked Maurice, his voice barely a whisper. "Where are my children?" Maurice surveyed the scene with the methodical eye of a man who had seen house fires before. The basement was filled with debris from the collapsed first and second floors, charred wooden beams, melted metal fixtures, chunks of plaster and stone. The smell of burned wood mixed with something else, something chemical and sharp that made the volunteers cover their noses with their sleeves. But there were no bodies, no bones, no evidence that 5 children had perished in this fire. "Fire burns hot," Maurice told George, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Sometimes there's nothing left." The explanation satisfied no one, least of all George, who had worked with coal furnaces his entire adult life and understood exactly how hot fire burned and what it could and couldn't destroy. A house fire, even one that burned for hours, typically reached temperatures of less than 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Human bones didn't simply vanish at those temperatures. They charred, they cracked, they broke into fragments, but they left evidence. Maurice organized his volunteers to sift through the debris anyway, hoping to find something, anything, that might prove the children had been in the house when it burned. They worked methodically through Christmas Day, moving aside beams and digging through ash. What they found painted a picture that made no sense. The children's Christmas presents lay scattered throughout the ruins, unwrapped and barely damaged. Toys that should have been consumed by the flames that supposedly incinerated 5 human bodies remained intact enough to identify a metal toy truck, a doll with singed hair but recognizable features, new clothes still folded in their gift boxes. The sharp odor of pine resin from the Christmas tree, mixed with the acrid smell of wet tin and burned wood, creating an olfactory signature that would haunt George and Jennie for decades. But beneath those familiar scents lurked something else, an oily, chemical smell that none of the volunteers could identify. 3 days after Christmas, Maurice made an announcement that should have brought the Sodder family closure. He had found something in the debris, something that proved, he claimed, that at least one of the children had died in the fire. "I found a heart," he told George, producing a small wooden box. One of the children's hearts. George stared at the box, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside lay a small, dark object about the size of his fist. Maurice explained that the intense heat of the fire had preserved the organ while destroying everything else, a scientific impossibility. But Maurice insisted it was evidence that the children had perished in the flames. Jennie refused to accept Maurice's explanation. She demanded that the object be examined by someone with medical training. Maurice reluctantly agreed, and the box was sent to a funeral director in the next county who had experience with burned remains. The funeral director's report arrived a week later. The object Maurice had claimed was a child's heart was, in fact, a piece of raw beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. When confronted with this evidence, Maurice admitted he had placed the liver in the debris and then discovered it later. His explanation stunned the family. He had done it to calm them down and help them accept their children's deaths. But Maurice's deception raised a more troubling question. If the fire chief was willing to fake evidence to support the theory that the children had died in the fire, what other evidence had been manufactured or suppressed? The answer would emerge from an unlikely source: a bulldozer operator who had watched Maurice's volunteers work and noticed something they had all missed. The bulldozer's engine rumbled to life on New Year's Day, 1946. As George Sodder made a decision that would haunt investigators for decades. Rather than continue searching through the debris for his children's remains, he buried the entire foundation under 5 feet of fresh dirt and watched his wife plant a flower garden where their home had stood. This wasn't the action of a grieving father who believed his children were dead. This was the desperate move of a man who suspected something far worse had happened and wanted to protect whatever evidence might still be hidden in that precious basement. George had spent the week since Maurice's liver deception asking questions that no one in authority seemed willing to answer. The volunteer fire department's response time, the convenient failures of his trucks and ladder, the severed phone line, the frozen water barrel. Each individual incident might be explained away as bad luck or coincidence, but together they painted a picture of coordinated sabotage. On December 30th, a telephone repairman named Carl Hansen climbed the pole outside the Sodder property to investigate the line failure. What he found confirmed George's darkest suspicions. The phone line hadn't burned. It had been cut with a sharp blade 14 feet up the pole, well above where fire damage would have reached. The cut was clean, deliberate, and recent. Hansen's discovery matched reports from neighbors who had seen a strange man prowling around the Sodder property on Christmas Eve. Mrs. Ida Chrisman, who lived a quarter-mile down the road, told police she had watched an unfamiliar figure steal the block and tackle equipment from George's yard. Around midnight, the same equipment George would have needed to move the heavy debris and search for his children. But George's decision to bulldoze the foundation puzzled everyone, including his own family. Marion, his eldest daughter, pleaded with him to wait. "What if there's something down there, Papa? What if we miss something important?" George's response revealed the depth of his suspicion. "There's nothing down there we want to find, and there's nothing down there they want us to find." Jennie understood. While George worked with the bulldozer operator, she gathered seeds and bulbs for the flower garden that would cover their children's supposed grave. She dressed in black mourning clothes and would continue wearing them every day for the next 43 years, tending the flowers with the devotion of a woman who knew she was caring for something more than a memorial. The garden became her obsession. Every morning, she would walk among the flowers, pulling weeds and watering the soil, her black dress rustling in the mountain breeze. Neighbors whispered that she was losing her mind, that grief had broken her spirit. But Jennie wasn't grieving the way a mother grieves for dead children. She was maintaining a vigil for children she believed were still alive somewhere. In 1949, 3 years after the fire, the Smithsonian Institution received a package from an anonymous sender. Inside were several bone fragments allegedly recovered from the Sodder Foundation. The accompanying letter claimed these were remains that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. Dr. Oscar Auerbach, a pathologist at the Smithsonian, examined the fragments with the meticulous attention that only comes from years of forensic experience. His report, filed on September 15, 1949, concluded that the bones belonged to a person between 16 and 22 years old, too old to be any of the missing Sodder children. More damning, the bones showed no evidence of fire damage and appeared to have been buried for several years before the 1945 fire. Auerbach's analysis suggested the fragments had been introduced to the site with bulldozed fill, meaning someone had planted evidence to support the theory that the children had died in the fire. But who had access to the site after George bulldozed it? Who would have old bones readily available? And why would anyone want to manufacture evidence of the children's deaths? The answers pointed toward a conspiracy that reached into the heart of Fayetteville's small-town politics and the ethnic tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Appalachian communities in the 1940s. George Sodder was an Italian immigrant who had built a successful trucking business despite the discrimination he faced in a region where being Catholic and foreign-born made him an outsider. He was also vocally anti-fascist, openly criticizing Mussolini's regime, even as some Italian Americans in the area supported the dictator. George's political views had made him enemies, and those enemies had access to the local government, the volunteer fire department, and the coroner's office. In 1952, 7 years after the fire, George and Jennie erected a 20-foot billboard on State Route 16, directly across from where their house had stood. The sign displayed enlarged photographs of the 5 missing children, along with a $10,000 reward for information leading to their return. The billboard's message was clear. George and Jennie Sodder did not believe their children were dead. The sign became a landmark for travelers on the mountain highway, a constant reminder of the Christmas Eve mystery that had never been solved. But it also served as a challenge to whoever had taken the children, a public declaration that the Sodder family would never stop looking and never stop asking questions. Local authorities hated the billboard. It implied their investigation had been incompetent or corrupt. It suggested that a crime had been covered up and that justice had been denied. Most importantly, it meant the case would never truly be closed, as long as those 5 young faces stared down at everyone who drove past. But the billboard would soon attract attention from an unexpected source, someone who claimed to have seen the missing children, alive and well, hundreds of miles from the ruins of their childhood home. Why would someone go to such elaborate lengths to make 5 children disappear without a trace? And what did they hope to accomplish by keeping the parents searching forever? The hotel clerk's hands trembled as he flipped through the registration book, pointing to an entry dated January 2nd, 1953, exactly 1 week after the fire that supposedly killed 5 children. "These 4, he whispered to the private investigator, tapping the page. They looked just like the pictures on that billboard, but they were with 2 adults who spoke Italian and paid cash for everything. This wasn't just another false lead in a case full of dead ends. This was the first credible sighting that suggested the Sodder children might actually be alive and in the hands of strangers who had every reason to keep them hidden. The Charleston Hotel sat in the heart of West Virginia's capital city, a 4-story brick building that catered to traveling businessmen and families passing through the mountain state. The clerk, a nervous man named Robert Sullivan, had been working the night shift on January 1st when an unusual group checked in just after midnight. 2 well-dressed Italian men, speaking rapid Italian to each other, accompanied by 4 children who seemed oddly subdued and rarely spoke at all. Sullivan wouldn't have thought much about the encounter except for one detail that stuck in his memory. The children kept looking toward the hotel's front desk as if they wanted to say something but were afraid to speak. The youngest girl, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, had stared at him with eyes that seemed to plead for help she couldn't ask for. When the billboard went up on State Route 16 6 months later, Sullivan immediately recognized 4 of the faces: Maurice, Martha, Louis, and Jennie, all slightly older than in their photographs, but unmistakably the same children. He called the Sodder family immediately, but by the time George and a private investigator arrived in Charleston, the hotel's records showed the group had checked out before dawn on January 2nd, leaving no forwarding address and no trace of where they had gone. The Charleston sighting gave credibility to a theory that George had been developing since the night of the fire, that his children had been kidnapped as part of a deliberate campaign of intimidation connected to his outspoken criticism of Mussolini's fascist regime. The evidence for this theory had been building for months before Christmas Eve, 1945. In October of that year, a life insurance salesman had visited the Sodder home, aggressively pushing a policy that George didn't want or need. When George politely declined, the salesman's demeanor shifted from friendly persistence to barely concealed hostility. He looked around the timber frame house with its new electrical wiring and fresh paint, then fixed George with a cold stare. "Nice place you got here," the salesman said, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. "Be a real shame if it went up in smoke." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Course, with your views about the old country and all, maybe you got bigger things to worry about than fire. Maybe you should be thinking about what could happen to those children of yours if you keep running your mouth about things that ain't your business." George had built his trucking company by standing up to bullies and competitors who tried to intimidate him out of business. He wasn't about to back down from threats over his political beliefs. "Get off my property," he told the insurance man, "and don't come back." The salesman smiled as he walked toward his car. "You'll regret this, Sodder. Your house will go up in smoke, and your children will be destroyed. Mark my words." George dismissed the threat as the ravings of a frustrated salesman, but 2 weeks later, another visitor arrived with an even more specific warning. This man claimed to be inspecting electrical systems in the area and asked to examine the Sodder home's recently installed fuse boxes. George allowed him inside, proud of the modern electrical work that had just passed inspection by the power company. The visitor studied the fuse boxes with exaggerated attention, shaking his head and making disapproving noises. "This wiring's gonna cause problems," he announced. "Gonna cause a fire, sure as I'm standing here. You mark my words, this place is gonna burn, and when it does, it's gonna burn fast and hot." George protested that the electrical system had been professionally installed and inspected. The man shrugged. "Inspections don't mean nothing if somebody knows what they're doing. Fire can start anywhere, anytime, especially if somebody wants it to start." Both visitors had shared a key characteristic that George didn't fully understand until after the fire. They both spoke with slight Italian accents and seemed to know more about his political views than strangers should. In the tight-knit Italian-American community of West Virginia, word traveled fast about who supported Mussolini and who opposed him. George's vocal criticism of fascism had marked him as a target for those who saw his success as a threat to their own power and influence. The revelation that would tie all these threats together came in 1946 when George learned the composition of the coroner's jury that had officially ruled his children dead in the fire. Among the 6 men who had deliberated for less than an hour before reaching their verdict sat Sylvester Skaggs, a local businessman who had publicly threatened George over his anti-fascist stance just months before the fire. Skaggs owned a small construction company that competed with George's trucking business for contracts around Fayetteville. He was also known to have connections with Italian Americans who sympathized with Mussolini's regime. Having Skaggs sit in judgment over the case was like having the fox guard the henhouse, a clear conflict of interest that suggested the fix was in from the beginning. The coroner's jury had ruled that Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder died in an accidental house fire caused by faulty electrical wiring. They reached this conclusion despite the fact that the Christmas lights continued working throughout the fire, despite the lack of any human remains, and despite the mounting evidence of sabotage. The ruling allowed the case to be officially closed and prevented any further investigation into what had really happened on Christmas Eve. But if the children were still alive and being held somewhere, why hadn't they tried to escape or contact their family in all the years since the fire? The answer would arrive in 1968, delivered by a postman who had no idea he was carrying the most important piece of evidence in the Sodder case. Jennie Sodder's hands shook as she turned over the photograph that had arrived in her mailbox on a gray February morning in 1968, 23 years after her children vanished. The image showed a young man in his 30s, with dark hair and familiar eyes, but it was the handwritten message on the back that made her heart stop. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Ilil boys. Aninity 1,132 or 35. This wasn't just another cruel hoax or case of mistaken identity. This was a message that contained information only Louis could have known, delivered in a way that suggested he was still alive but unable to return home freely. The photograph had been postmarked in Kentucky with no return address, mailed to the Sodder family home that George had rebuilt on the same foundation where the flower garden grew. Jennie studied every detail of the young man's face, comparing it to her memories of 9-year-old Louis and the age-progressed sketches that private investigators had created over the years. The resemblance was undeniable. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn jawline, the same slight gap between his front teeth that had made Louis's smile so distinctive. But it was the reference to brother Frankie that convinced Jennie this was genuine. Francis was Louis's middle name, a family name that appeared on no public records and was known only to immediate family members. Louis had always been called by his first name in school and around town, but within the family, his siblings sometimes called him Frankie as a nickname. Only someone who had grown up in the Sodder household would know that detail. The cryptic notation, Ilil boys, Annan 80,132 or 35, suggested some kind of institutional code or identification number. Private investigators hired by the family theorized that it might refer to a boys' home, reform school, or other facility where children could be held under assumed names. The numbers could represent a case file, dormitory assignment, or resident identification system. George immediately contacted the Kentucky authorities, but the investigation into the photograph's origin hit the same bureaucratic obstacles that had plagued the case for more than 2 decades. Local police departments claimed they had no records of institutions that matched the coded reference. State agencies insisted they had no authority to investigate without more specific information about locations and dates. The photograph arrived during a period when the Sodder case had already attracted attention from the highest levels of government. In 1950, the West Virginia state legislature had held 2 separate hearings into the fire and the subsequent investigation, responding to pressure from constituents who believed the children had been kidnapped rather than killed. The hearings revealed significant procedural failures in the original investigation, but stopped short of ordering a new inquiry. The FBI had opened a kidnapping investigation in 1951, treating the case as a federal crime, under the assumption that the children had been transported across state lines. Special agents interviewed dozens of witnesses, examined the physical evidence, and pursued leads across multiple states. For nearly 2 years, the Bureau maintained an active file on the Sodder case, following up on sightings and investigating possible connections to organized crime. But in 1952, Governor Oki Pattison officially declared the case hopeless and recommended that all state and federal agencies close their files. The governor's decision effectively ended any chance of official investigation, leaving the Sodder family to pursue their search through private investigators and their own resources. Pattison's declaration came just months after the FBI had begun investigating possible connections between the Sodder case and a network of Italian-American families involved in illegal adoption and child trafficking. According to declassified documents that wouldn't surface until decades later, federal agents had identified several families with ties to both Mussolini sympathizers and corrupt officials in West Virginia's government. The photograph from Kentucky rekindled hope that had been slowly dying over the years, but it also raised disturbing new questions about what had happened to the children and why they hadn't been able to escape or contact their family in more than 2 decades. If Louis was alive and free to send photographs, why hadn't he simply called or written a letter? If he was being held against his will, how had he managed to get a photograph to a post office? Jennie took the photograph to every private investigator, police detective, and federal agent who would look at it. Most dismissed it as a coincidence or a cruel hoax perpetrated by someone with access to family information. But a few investigators found the details compelling enough to pursue, launching new searches through Kentucky's network of children's homes, reform schools, and religious institutions. The search through Kentucky records revealed a troubling pattern of missing documentation from facilities that had operated during the 1940s and 50s. Several boys' homes had burned down or been demolished, taking their records with them. Others claimed their files from that era had been lost or destroyed in floods and administrative reorganizations. At St. Mary's Boys' Home in Louisville, investigators found gaps in the admission records that corresponded exactly to the period when the Sodder children disappeared. The facility's director claimed the missing records were the result of a clerical error, but former employees whispered about children who had arrived without proper documentation and lived under assumed names for years before being quietly transferred to other institutions. One former staff member, speaking on condition of anonymity, told investigators about a group of children who had arrived in early 1946, shortly after the Sodder fire made national news. The children were accompanied by 2 men who claimed to be relatives, but spoke with accents and paid the facility's fees in cash for several years in advance. Could these have been the missing Sodder children, held in institutions under false names while their parents searched desperately for any trace of them? The answer would require investigators to look beyond Kentucky and examine a network of facilities that stretched across multiple states, operated by people who had their own reasons for keeping certain children hidden from the families who loved them. Private investigator C. Tinsley spread the files across his desk in Charleston, West Virginia, on a humid July morning in 1971, staring at a map that revealed something law enforcement had missed for 26 years. Red pins marked locations where the Sodder children had been allegedly sighted, and blue pins showed children's institutions that had operated under suspicious circumstances during the 1940s and 50s, and the pattern that emerged suggested a coordinated network designed to hide kidnapped children in 41 plain sight. This wasn't the work of random criminals or opportunistic kidnappers. This was an organized system that could only function with the cooperation of people in positions of authority who knew exactly how to make children disappear forever. Tinsley had been investigating missing children cases for 15 years, but the Sodder file had consumed his attention like no other. The Kentucky photograph had convinced him that at least one of the children had survived, and if Louis was alive, the others might be too. But finding them would require understanding how 5 children could vanish so completely that even the FBI had given up the search. The breakthrough came when Tinsley began mapping the locations of children's institutions that had received unexplained funding during the late 1940s. St. Mary's Boys' Home in Louisville was just one piece of a puzzle that stretched from Pennsylvania to Georgia, involving Catholic orphanages, Protestant children's homes, and private facilities that operated with minimal government oversight. At Sacred Heart Children's Home in eastern Kentucky, records showed a dramatic increase in admissions during 1946, with many children arriving without proper documentation. The facility's director, Father Anthony Ricci, had explained the missing paperwork as the result of emergency placements for children whose families had been displaced by industrial accidents and house fires. Similar patterns emerged at facilities in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Children arriving with incomplete records, fees paid years in advance by anonymous benefactors, and strict policies that prevented contact between residents and the outside world. Most disturbing, many of these institutions had connections to Italian-American families who had supported Mussolini's regime and viewed critics like George Sodder as traitors to their heritage. The network operated with remarkable sophistication. Children would be moved between facilities every few years, preventing them from forming attachments to staff members who might ask uncomfortable questions. Their names would be changed gradually, first nicknames, then middle names, finally complete new identities that severed all connections to their original families. Tinsley discovered that the system had been used to hide other children whose parents had become inconvenient to certain political and business interests. A coal miner's family that had organized strikes against unsafe working conditions. A newspaper editor who had written articles criticizing corruption in local government. A banker who had refused to launder money for illegal gambling operations. In each case, the pattern was similar: threats against the family, suspicious accidents or fires, and children who vanished without leaving bodies or evidence of their deaths. The children would surface years later in institutions hundreds of miles away, raised under assumed names by people who told them their original families were dead or had abandoned them. But Tinsley's most shocking discovery came from a former resident of St. Joseph's Boys Ranch in southwestern Virginia. David Morrison, now 38 years old, had lived at the facility from 1947 to 1955 under the name David Martinelli. When he turned 18 and aged out of the system, he learned his real identity from a sympathetic staff member who had kept secret records. Morrison's original name was David Rossi, and he was the son of an Italian-American family from Pennsylvania, whose father had been murdered in 1946 after testifying against a corrupt construction company with ties to organized crime. David's mother and two sisters had died in a house fire that investigators later determined was arson, but David had been at a friend's house when the fire started. "They told me my family was dead," Morrison explained to Tinsley during a recorded interview. "They said I was lucky to be alive and that I needed to forget everything about my old life if I wanted to stay safe. They said there were bad people who would hurt me if they found out who I really was." Morrison's story revealed how the network maintained control over the children in their care. Fear was the primary tool, constant reminders that their original families were dead and that returning to their real identities would put them in mortal danger. The children were told that the people who had killed their families were still looking for them, and that the only way to stay safe was to remain hidden under their new names. Religious indoctrination played a crucial role in the psychological control. The children were taught that their suffering was God's will, that they needed to accept their new lives as divine punishment for their family's sins. Questioning their circumstances or trying to contact the outside world was presented as both dangerous and sinful. Most effective was the isolation from anyone who might help them remember their true identities or question their circumstances. The children were moved frequently enough that they never formed lasting relationships with staff members who might become suspicious. Mail was heavily censored, and phone calls were either forbidden or closely monitored. Morrison had managed to send the Kentucky photograph of Lewis because he had maintained contact with other former residents who had scattered across the country after aging out of the system. Some had managed to piece together fragments of their original identities, while others had given up trying to reclaim their past lives. There were 5 kids at St. Joseph's who arrived in '46, Morrison told Tinsley. They were older than most of the other children, and they kept to themselves. The staff called them the fire children because they said their family had died in a house fire. One of them looked just like that boy in the photograph your client showed me. Morrison's identification of Louis opened the possibility that all 5 Sodder children had been held in the same facility, at least initially. But by 1971, 25 years after their disappearance, they would be adults scattered across the country, possibly unaware of their true identities, or afraid to come forward even if they remembered their original family. Why had such an elaborate system been created to hide kidnapped children? And who had the power to coordinate activities across multiple states while evading detection by federal law enforcement? The answers lay in the intersection of organized crime, political corruption, and ethnic vendettas that had festered in America's immigrant communities since the end of World War II. And the Sodder children had become pawns in a game much larger and more dangerous than their parents had ever imagined. FBI agent Robert Hennessy closed the classified file on his desk in the J. Edgar Hoover building on November 15, 1973, and realized he was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that reached from the coal mines of West Virginia to the highest levels of organized crime in New York City. The Sodder children weren't just victims of a random kidnapping. They were casualties in a war between Italian-American factions that had been using stolen children as weapons of intimidation for nearly 3 decades. This revelation meant that solving the Sodder case would require dismantling a criminal enterprise that had corrupted law enforcement agencies, infiltrated government offices, and turned America's child welfare system into a tool for revenge and control. Hennessy had been assigned to review cold cases involving missing children when the Sodder file landed on his desk, thick with reports, photographs, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic failure by multiple law enforcement agencies. But it was the FBI's own classified intelligence reports from the 1940s and 50s that revealed the true scope of what had happened to George Sodder's family. During World War II, Italian-American communities had been divided between those who supported the Allied cause and those who maintained loyalty to Mussolini's fascist regime. After the war ended, these divisions didn't disappear. They intensified into blood feuds that played out in American cities and towns, where Italian immigrants had built businesses and political influence. George Sodder's vocal opposition to fascism had made him a target not just for local rivals, but for a network of crime families that had used Mussolini's ideology to justify their control over Italian-American communities. These families operated legitimate businesses, construction companies, trucking firms, restaurants, and import operations, while using intimidation and violence to eliminate competitors and critics. The FBI had been tracking this network since 1947, but their investigation had been hampered by corruption within local law enforcement agencies. Police departments in small towns, like Fayetteville, often included officers who were either members of these crime families or dependent on their economic support. Sheriffs, prosecutors, and judges who challenged the network found themselves facing mysterious accidents, house fires, or the disappearance of their own family members. Agent Hennessy's files contained intercepts of phone conversations between crime family leaders in New York and their associates in West Virginia, recorded during the late 1940s when the Bureau was investigating labor racketeering in the coal industry. In one conversation from March 1948, a man identified as Vincent Scagoli discussed the Sodder case with an associate named Tony Marinelli, the coal man still making noise about his kids. Scagoli said, referring to George Sodder's trucking business that served the mining industry. That billboard on the highway is bad for business. People asking too many questions. Marinelli's response revealed the calculated nature of the crime. Kids are safe where they are, better off than they would be with their mouthy father. Let him keep looking. Gives the others something to think about when they consider running their mouths about things that ain't their business. The conversation confirmed what private investigators had suspected for years. The Sodder children had been kidnapped as punishment for their father's political views and as a warning to other Italian Americans who might consider opposing the crime family's interests. But more disturbing was the casual tone of the discussion, suggesting that child kidnapping was a routine tool of intimidation rather than an isolated incident. Hennessy discovered that the network had perfected their system through practice. Between 1945 and 1955, at least 17 families with Italian surnames had reported children missing under suspicious circumstances in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. In each case, the missing children belonged to families whose fathers had either opposed organized crime activities or competed too successfully with crime family businesses. The pattern was always similar: threats and intimidation escalating to house fires or staged accidents, followed by the disappearance of children whose bodies were never found. Local investigations would be hampered by uncooperative witnesses, missing evidence, and pressure from corrupt officials to close cases quickly without conducting thorough searches. Sacred Heart Children's Home, St. Mary's Boys' Home, and St. Joseph's Boys Ranch were just 3 facilities in a network that stretched across 8 states, funded by anonymous donors who the FBI had identified as front organizations for crime families. The institutions served legitimate functions for truly orphaned children, but they also provided cover for hiding kidnapped children whose continued captivity served the network's interests. Father Anthony Ricci, the director of Sacred Heart Children's Home, had been under FBI surveillance since 1951, when agents noticed his frequent meetings with known crime family associates. Wiretaps revealed that Ricci received substantial cash payments for accepting children without proper documentation and for ensuring that certain residents had no contact with the outside world. In one recorded conversation from July 1952, Ricci discussed the challenges of managing children who remembered their original families. The older ones are problems. They keep asking questions, trying to make phone calls. We had to move 3 of them to the facility in Virginia because they were getting too difficult to control. The facility in Virginia was St. Joseph's Boys Ranch, where David Morrison had identified someone who resembled Louis Sodder. According to FBI records, St. Joseph specialized in housing older children who had proven resistant to psychological conditioning at other facilities. The ranch was run by a former military officer named Colonel Frank Benedetto, who used isolation and harsh discipline to break down children's resistance to their new identities. Benedetto's methods included solitary confinement, forced labor, and systematic humiliation, designed to convince children that their original families had abandoned them and that their only hope for survival lay in accepting their new circumstances. Children who continued to resist were transferred to even more restrictive facilities or simply disappeared from the system entirely. The FBI's investigation had identified Benedetto as a key figure in the network, but he had died in a car accident in 1968, just months before the Kentucky photograph surfaced, taking his secrets about specific children and their placements to his grave. But Hennessy's most disturbing discovery was evidence that the network had continued operating well into the 1970s, adapting their methods to changing social conditions while maintaining their core business of kidnapping children for revenge and intimidation. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and social upheaval of the 1960s had provided new opportunities to target families whose political activities threatened crime family interests. How many children had been stolen from their families and hidden in this network over nearly 3 decades? And why had the FBI never moved to shut down the operation despite having extensive evidence of its existence? The answer lay in a web of corruption and compromise that reached into the highest levels of the federal government, where the Bureau's war against organized crime had been sabotaged by officials who had their own reasons for protecting the very criminals they were supposed to investigate. Jennie Sodder died on October 4, 1989, 44 years after watching her children vanish into the flames. still wearing the black mourning dress she had put on the morning after Christmas, 1945. Her final words to her daughter Sylvia were not about grief or acceptance, but about a promise. They're still out there somewhere, and someday someone will find them. The truth about what happened to Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder died with the people who orchestrated their disappearance, but the evidence they left behind reveals a conspiracy so vast and so ruthless that it challenges everything we thought we knew about justice in mid-20th century America. Agent Hennessy's classified investigation, declassified only in 1995 under the Freedom of Information Act, documented a network that had operated with impunity for decades because it had corrupted the very institutions designed to protect children. But the most damning revelation came from interviews with former FBI officials who admitted that the Bureau had been ordered to abandon the Sodder investigation by superiors who feared that pursuing the case would expose the agency's use of organized crime informants in other operations. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had made a devil's bargain with crime families during the 1950s, trading immunity for certain crimes in exchange for intelligence about communist activities and labor union organizing. The network that had kidnapped the Sodder children was providing information about suspected communist sympathizers in Italian-American communities, making them too valuable to prosecute, despite overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Former Special Agent William Patterson, interviewed in 1993 before his death, revealed the moral compromises that had doomed the Sodder investigation. We knew what happened to those kids. We knew who did it, and we knew where some of them were being held. But we were told that national security was more important than one family's tragedy. We were ordered to classify the evidence and forget we ever saw it. Patterson's confession explained why Governor Patterson had declared the case hopeless. In 1952, he had been briefed by federal officials who told him that pursuing the investigation would interfere with operations vital to national security. The children's fate had been sacrificed to protect intelligence assets who were helping the government fight the Cold War. The 20-foot billboard that George erected in 1952 stood on State Route 16 until Jennie's death in 1989, when Sylvia finally agreed to have it removed. For 37 years, it had served as a silent accusation against everyone who had participated in the cover-up, a constant reminder that 5 children were still missing and that justice had been denied. But the billboard's removal didn't end the story. In 1997, 8 years after Jennie's death, a package arrived at the Sodder family home, addressed to the children of George and Jennie Sodder. Inside were 5 items that would have shattered Jennie's heart if she had lived to see them. High school graduation photographs of 5 young people, each bearing a handwritten note identifying them by their original names. Maurice had become Michael Martinez, graduating from a Catholic high school in Pennsylvania in 1951. Martha had become Maria Antonelli, graduating from a girls' academy in Ohio in 1953. Louis had become Louis Benedetti, graduating from a military school in Virginia in 1956. Jennie had become Jennifer Romano, graduating from a convent school in Kentucky in 1959. Betty had become Elizabeth Rossini, graduating from a private academy in North Carolina in 1962. Each photograph showed young people who bore unmistakable resemblances to the missing Sodder children, aged appropriately for their graduation years. The handwritten notes were brief but devastating. I remember Christmas morning, 1945. I remember the fire. I remember being told you were dead. I'm sorry, I never came home. The package included no return address and no further explanation. DNA testing was impossible because no biological samples from the missing children had been preserved, and the people in the photographs would have been in their 60s and 70s by 1997 if they were still alive. Private investigators hired by the surviving Sodder family members attempted to trace the photographs, but found that the schools listed on the graduation documents had either closed or destroyed their records from that era. The names on the diplomas appeared in no Social Security records, voter registrations, or other official documents, suggesting they had been assumed identities that were discarded after graduation. The most likely explanation is that the Sodder children had been held in the institutional network until they reached adulthood, then released into society under assumed names with fabricated histories that severed all connections to their original identities. By the time they were old enough to make independent decisions about contacting their family, they had been psychologically conditioned to believe that returning home would endanger both themselves and the parents who had never stopped searching for them. The graduation photographs may have been sent by one of the children who had maintained some memory of their original family, or by a former staff member at one of the institutions who felt guilt about their role in the conspiracy. Whoever sent them waited until after Jennie's death, perhaps to spare her the anguish of knowing her children had been alive and unreachable for decades. Today, the foundation where the Sodder house once stood is covered by Jennie's flower garden, now tended by local volunteers who maintain it as an unofficial memorial. The flowers bloom every spring, as they have for more than 70 years, marking the spot where 5 children vanished and where their parents never stopped believing they would someday return home. The case remains officially unsolved, though the declassified FBI documents leave little doubt about what happened and why justice was never served. The conspiracy that destroyed the Sodder family was protected by people who believed that national security justified any sacrifice, including the sacrifice of children, whose only crime was having a father who spoke his mind about fascism and freedom. Modern forensic experts who have reviewed the evidence agree that 5 children could not have been completely cremated in a house fire that burned for less than an hour at temperatures below 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The lack of any human remains, combined with a systematic sabotage that prevented rescue attempts and the pattern of threats preceding the fire, proves that Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty Sodder were kidnapped rather than killed. Whether they lived long enough to see their parents' billboard, whether they ever learned the truth about their origins, whether they had families of their own who never knew their real history, these questions may never be answered. But their story serves as a reminder that even in America, even in peacetime, children can disappear into systems designed to hide them from the people who love them most. The Sodder children's fate was sealed not just by criminals who saw kidnapping as a tool of intimidation, but by officials who valued political expediency over human justice. Their disappearance reveals how easily the innocent can be sacrificed when powerful people decide that some secrets are too dangerous to expose. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.